I got my start in stunt flying, learning to fly. What happened was that that helps. When I was a teenager in high school, my folks forbid me to buy a motorcycle. And my hobby was taking pictures of airplanes, so I was out at the airport one day and found that this old Luskin that I could buy for a little bit more than what I saved up for the motorcycle, and I didn't need any parental permission to buy it. There was no signature required. So I went and bought it, and I had this smug secret for 2 weeks until the registration came in the mail. And I think the cracks in the ceiling are still there where my folks collectively hit the roof. But I got into air shows first, and this was the way I got into movie stunt flying. And this was my favorite air show. This was a old Aranca Champ that I rigged to fall apart in midair. I had seen the movie Mad, Mad World, and if you remember the old biplane where it progressively falls apart with that couple as they're going for the gold. And I was looking for a biplane at that time, and a friend of mine convinced me to try as Champ. And the worst condition I could fly it in was with the rudder, the right aileron, and the left elevator missing. Of course, you couldn't do a whole lot of aerobatics with it, so if you wanted to do aerobatics, you had to leave the rudder on. But we'd put this plane together in front of the crowd, and then I'd take off and fly around, and of course pieces would come off the airplane. And that was a real crowd pleaser. And here's during a snap roll, and it was, they said it was very spectacular to see this thing come spinning down and just shedding parts on the way down. And, but what was even more fun was going to and from an air show. Because people along the way, you'd go to some spam can airport that had a Cessna dealer and a Piper dealer and so forth, and maybe an airport cafe, and you'd pull up to the gas pump, and you could have a lot of fun with something that looked like it was wrecked already. And the best one I ever pulled off was at Albany, Oregon in August of '68. I was flying back from a air show several air shows in Canada, and I got in downwind at Albany, and I'd moved the mag switch up to the front panel so I could reach it easily. And I had 2 spark plugs disconnected from the right mag and 1 from the left. So on both mags I had all 4 cylinders, ran fine. But if I start switching back and forth between left and right, the engine would cough and backfire and bang and belch. And that was enough to get people on the ground looking up to see what was going on. And as they did so, I'd pull the string on the smoke grenades mounted on the firewall, and the whole cowling is erupted in smoke. Just streaming back. And by the way, this is how I normally flew cross country. I just left the parts inside the airplane. And
let's drag. Let's drag.
And at Albany, as I turned base and turned final, I saw the crash truck coming out to meet me. This is not a tower-controlled field, understand. And I landed, and below 20 miles an hour, I could ground loop it in either direction and do nothing more than scuff up the tires. I had the gear kind of clamped together so it wouldn't fold or anything on me. And so, got slow enough, I hit hard right rudder and brake, spun the plane around a couple of times and slid to a stop going backwards. And as I came to a stop, the truck comes up along my left wing, and they jump out, and I slide the window open and say, "What's all the excitement about?" And this one fireman says, "You're on fire." And I said, "No, the engine noses that when I close the throttle." And I took it over to the gas pump. You know, they gave me a dirty look, and I disappeared. I took it over to the gas pump and asked the line boy to fill it up with regular. He says, "What do you mean regular?" And I said, "Well, whatever the red stuff is." And so he's on the left side of the fuselage, filling up this nose tank. there's me landing in the airport. I never land not in a slip, as you can see. It really slipped good with that missing aileron. The control stops were also cut off so I could go to 90 degrees deflection on the controls. But anyhow, he's filling it up. I'm puttering around inside the cockpit, and what he can't see is that I've got a control leading up into the firewall area. And I had a 2-quart container of old drain oil with some metal shavings mixed in that you did not need a magnet to find. You could hear them hit the ground. And I pulled the plug on that, and suddenly this cowling is just running with this stuff. And 2 quarts looks like the engine just dumped the whole load. And he's nicely putting it in, and suddenly looks down. I always did this just before they finished, so I'd have the gas in there. And he looks down, he shuts off his pump, steps back out of the way, and tells me, "I've got a terrible oil leak." And I say, "Yeah, I know there's a crack in the case. Would you please check the oil level for me?" And it's the old magician's trick. If you give them a suggestion, they'll follow it along, even though it's absurd. And so he went around to my cowling and pulled out the dipstick. Well, Continental dipstick, you know, they've got a cap about this big around with a dipstick attached. And I'd shortened the dipstick at the cap end. So it always read 3.5 quarts short. So anytime the oil went off the end of the stick, I needed to put another quart in. But as long as it showed anything, I was full. So he pulled it out and read 1/2 quart. And he looked at that and he showed it to me with a "Here, you idiot" look on his face. And I said, "Oh, that's plenty. I always file a little bit low because that's just below the crack. Any more intense." And he gave up and walked away, and the plane was starting to attract some attention. And this was before it was painted. The back end was later painted yellow with black trim. And of course the front end was painted white with blue trim. And there was a big baseball stitch that was sewn on by a friend of mine who later became a mortician. But anyhow, the airport manager showed up, and he was looking at this thing and was very disturbed by the fact that this was obviously not airworthy. And I had taken all the panels out of the inside, so if you looked inside the cockpit, you were actually looking at the backside of the fabric. And I had taken the steel tube and created fake rust spots on it, mixing Rust-Oleum with a fine-grained sand, painting this on several spots, and then over the so-called rust spots, put a light machine oil, and then spray painted the structure, just the structure. And over the so-called rust spots, the paint peeled as it dried. Had a really nice effect. And then in a couple of spots where there weren't any diagonals, we put in some genuinely rusted tubing coming together, not quite meeting. And the airport manager looked inside this thing, and he looked up at the airworthiness certificate. Well, the real one was under the seat. The one up here was a homemade with made out of yellow tablet paper with a ballpoint pen. And he looked at that, looked down at one of the genuinely broken ends with the rust on it, and he felt it, and the scale was coming off in his hands. And he turned to me and he said, "You can't fly this airplane around here like this." And I said, "Sure I can. See, these pieces haven't even rusted through yet." And anyhow, he stomped off. And people were looking at this airplane and saying, "Is this airplane really airworthy?" And I said, "Well, it needs a little work." And I always managed to stand just after the cockpit area on the right-hand side, because I'd cut a large section of fabric out, reinforced it against air loads, and then I kept a 2-quart container of the appropriate colored dope that I could dope paper on there. It looked just like part of the fabric. But I could throw my hand out and go right on through. And I had pulled this on this one guy, and he looked over and peeled it back, and it was trade-a-plane classified, and he said, "Oh, I just ran out of fabric when I got to that area." And as I taxied away, I had a hopper in the cowling out of which I could kick out old rusty nuts and bolts and spark plug with a broken lead, dribbling parts as I'm taxiing away. as I got out to the runway, you know, I wouldn't bother going down to the end of the runway because somebody had stopped me. And this is getting set for a trip. Somebody had almost stopped me, so I turned onto the runway, gave it full power, pulled off the runway at about 60 miles an hour. I had plenty of flying speed. Pulled it up sharply, pulled the left aileron release. The aileron comes tumbling end over and hits the runway. Field closes. And I'm wobbling, I'm bouncing down the runway and careening over the pole line at the end. And by the time I'm back on downwind, here comes the crash truck come out, and everybody's coming out of the hangars and every place else to watch me crash this thing. They come out past the last line of parked airplanes and the taxiway. And as I'm coming in on final, I just kind of bounce off the runway and then just kind of drift over toward the crowd, and they all turned and scattered. And I cut power, swung back, landed on the runway, rolled up to my aileron, got out, got the aileron, got it, jammed it inside, got in, shut the door, and took off and headed south. 2 days after I got back to LA, I got a phone call from the FAA asking me if I'd like to come in and discuss something with them. Turned out I was on that particular trip, I was reported as being 4 non-fatal accidents and 1 fatal accident.